welcome to ConTinual, the convention that never ends. My name is Jean Marie Ward. I will be your host today, and with us is award-winning author of the Emma Fielding Mysteries, the Fangborn Urban Fantasy series, numerous short stories, and the recently released A.K.A. Jayne thriller, Exit Interview. Welcome, Dana Cameron. We're so glad you could be with us.
Thank you so much for having me, Jean Marie.
Becoming a writer wasn't your first goal in life. What made you fall in love with archaeology?
Actually, being a writer was my first goal in life.
Really?
When I was real small, I mean, as soon as I learned to read, I wanted to be a writer. But way back when I was 4 or 5, and I had the idea that writers had to have terrible adventures in order to write about them, like running with the bulls, the whole Hemingway-esque sort of idea. And I guess it was coming through Rocky and Bullwinkle or the cartoons or something. But I am averse. I'm like Hobbit averse to adventures. And I'm thinking, well, that doesn't sound like much fun. I don't want to go to war. I don't want to get into a bar fight. What else would suit me? And then about the age of 10, I started learning about archaeology. And I'm like, oh, well, that checks all the boxes for me. I get to do research. I get to study history. I get to travel, maybe, study different languages. And that really was the thing. So by the time I was 10, it was pretty much, all set. And it really was a great fit for me. I loved it. Even the moments that were terrible and boring and bug bitten and everything else was pretty amazing work.
Great. What was your specialty?
My specialty was historical archaeology, colonial archaeology and contact period archaeology in New England, in the Northeast. So it was the first arrival of the Europeans and occasionally some of their interaction with the local native people they encountered. And with a little bit of British post-medieval archaeology thrown in, because you have to all know what was happening back in Britain and
the
in
old
Europe.
Country, yes.
Yeah, in order to understand what you're seeing here on the ground and how their ideas and artifacts made it over here.
Yeah, well, I saw that in Grave Consequences, the second book in the Emma Fielding series, and in the first book, where little pieces of certain types of pottery were key to the dating. And you don't know that unless you know the pottery styles, the porcelain styles, the glassware that were happening in England and Northern Europe at the time.
Oh yeah, I mean that's key. It's the decoration, the forms even change over time, and then when you start getting more and more trade with Asia, with China and Japan and India to a certain extent, you start seeing different forms, and that is also very useful to identify things. So we're always keen to find out what the interesting looking pottery is. Maybe there might be a mark on the bottom of it to tell us something about where it came from and who it was made for. So they're all clues.
And the date, because sometimes the marks change every 2 or 3 years, and it's
depending
wild.
on the pottery. Yeah.
Your experiences as an archaeologist inform every aspect of your most famous mystery series, the Emma Fielding series. But what your fans may not know is, in addition to all of these little experiences and all of this knowledge that you brought to it, that some of the more suspenseful moments were drawn from real life, your real life, in at least one case. Could you tell our viewers a little bit about that?
I was working on a 17th century site in Maine, and with my boss, we were surveying the site, making a map so that we could record where we were finding our materials. And a guy came up with a metal detector, and it's not legal to have and use a metal detector on a site that belongs to the state in Maine if you don't have a permit. And obviously we had all the permits. We had the right to be there and work. And he started digging. And so my boss spoke up to him, told him he couldn't be doing that. And the guy pulled a gun on us. And I remember I'd said before that I didn't really want adventures. This is exactly the sort of thing I was trying to avoid. And I was behind the transit, which is not a whole lot to hide behind. And I'm trying to think, do I run into the woods? Do I stay here? Is this guy going to start shooting us? And so I figured I'll memorize everything I can about him. about his license plate, his truck, and everything. And if he starts something, I was a little bit farther behind. I'm gonna book into the woods, look for a ranger or something. And finally he left because the woman he was with said that they didn't want trouble. And I'm like, we were just working here. He pulled a gun, so please don't blame us. And then we did find a ranger. We spoke to the local sheriff, and it took me a minute to realize that had really happened, and it was scary. And it really it made an impression on me. I had to, I never dug so fast as I did that summer in case he came back. I wanted to have some place to hide and a nice square hole. But I was telling a friend at the museum where I was based at the time about this. And she goes, "Oh, that doesn't happen to people." I'm like, "Yeah, it kind of happens to me and a lot of my friends. I mean, some of my friends in the Midwest got shot at for digging too close to someone's still. There was a time I was working in New Jersey and a cement mixer rolled off the highway onto the site where we'd been working. And if we hadn't been having a late lunch, things might have been very different for me." I said, "Yeah, it kind of happens all the time." She goes, "It doesn't happen to normal people. You need to write this down." And all of a sudden, boom, that early urge I had to write as a kid was there. And I'd always loved mysteries, read mysteries continuously my whole life. And so I'm like, okay, I have a guy with a metal detector and a gun, and I have an archaeologist in Maine. And that's where Sight Unseen came from.
Yeah, the excerpt that you can read on Amazon gets you just that far. That was sneaky. That was very sneaky.
Yes, yep. Gotta have the bait and the hook set and everything. You have to be, a little bit of a tease. Yeah.
One of the thing I love about the Emma Fielding mysteries that is so unusual, the books as opposed to the TV series, is the relationship between Emma and her husband, Brian Chang, who's not an archaeologist, but who's a constant presence on the phone. And it always made me think of, the Columbos, where Columbo is always talking about Mrs. Columbo, and on the spin-off series where Kate Mulgrew, later of
Yeah.
Star Trek fame, is always getting the phone calls. Yes. And that is so unusual in traditional mysteries, especially if you're dealing with a sleuth who is female and under the age of 60. What what prompted you to go in that direction with their, you know, make her married and go in that direction with her relationship?
There were a couple of things, really. At the time, I was looking for my forever job in academia. And I was going through a lot of the same things Emma was, in terms of she had the job and she was working for tenure. And she had, this mystery fall in her lap with the death of a close friend and everything. And I realized as I was writing the book, I really needed her to have one thing in her life that was working, that was really solid, to which she could go back and uh, do a head check, take strength from that relationship and everything. And I have that relationship with my husband, James. I refer to him as Mr. G on social media and everything. But he is the one person I can talk to and say, okay, I'm going to get the unvarnished truth from him, and I'm going to get the support I need. And so as for them being married, that wasn't really too much of a it didn't seem like a stretch for me. And I really liked her having that one thing to come back to when the rest of her life is falling apart.
Mhm.
And I like Brian. It was funny because I was trying to figure out who he was until I was at Boston University one day, and I stopped at a coffee shop, and the guy who was supposed to be making the coffee was laughing his head off trying to teach this person he was with, probably another student, how to do the chemistry work they were doing. And he was just having the best time and ignoring the fact that he was supposed to be making coffee. And I'm like, that's Brian. That's the energy I need. And so that's how Brian started to take shape, really.
Mhm.
And it's that kind of, I like the idea of him being in the hard sciences as well,
Mhm.
with her being in the social sciences, because there's always an interesting discourse there.
Mhm. And the joyousness of his character really comes through, which is a lovely counterpoint to the more the seriousness of Emma herself.
Mhm.
The other thing I really liked is how diverse the cast was. Brian, Chinese American from California, um, her dear friend Camille Shaw, Englishman by way of South Asia, and then one of my very favorite characters, who I would not want to meet in real life, Doris Sarks Robinson, the irrepressible, who is Black and plus size, and she works it, babe. She's got it. What made you take this traditional form into the area, into this diversity, and emphasize the inclusion? Is this, a reflection of your experiences in academia?
To a certain extent, I think it was. I mean, I at the time I was aware of how privileged and white and middle and upper class a lot of academia was, but it turns out that in archaeology you tend to have a bit more diversity. And I always liked that because part of the reason I went into archaeology was to learn about other people and see how we're different and how we're the same. And with a very few cultural differences, that culture, those cultural differences are very thin, and then underneath is how human beings behave. And so I always was fascinated by that, how the different ways that different cultures find to get along in the world. And so that was part of my reflection, and I just thought, well, I think Emma would have that same kind of attitude and want to know about these folks, and so she's gonna make friends wherever she finds amenable friends, amenable souls.
Mm-hmm. And or gets swept up in their wake in the case of Dora.
Yeah, yeah. I love Dora. She's not for everyone, but I did love her very much.
Yeah. Three of the books in the series were made into Hallmark Movies and Mysteries, and you were executive producer
Mhm.
for them. How did how did that come about? And also, how did you address or adjust to the changes that necessarily happen whenever a book or a series of books is translated from one medium to another?
Mm. Actually, it's funny and not funny at the same time. The books are actually out of physical print at the time. They're still available electronically, but they'd been out of physical print for about 10 years. And a year or so before the movies came out, my agent sent me an email, said, has anyone optioned the Emma Fielding books? I'm like, no. He says, well, there's been some interest. And then he, came back in pretty short order and said, these folks are interested, Muse Entertainment. I'm like, cool. Who knew? Why not? And I've had friends who've had their books translated into film or into a series, and they always say the same thing. If you have the opportunity, just cash the check and don't expect it to happen. It's like, okay, no problem. I'm happy to do that. But within about a few more months, they were talking about having the script in hand, having talent attached, and that was Courtney Thorne Smith, of course. And all of a sudden, it was being made. So it was within a year or so, and it was pretty amazing that it should happen at all, but that it should happen at that speed. And in terms of being an executive producer, actually, that means that I either brought money or content to the project, and of course, mine was the content. But it sounds really cool too. I mean, it looks nice, right? But for me, I always knew that there were going to be changes. At first, I was hoping, well, maybe they'll keep Brian. Maybe that would be kind of a neat thing to have. And I'm like, when I realized it was going to Hallmark, I'm like, no, their stock and trade is the cute meat and the building relationship. I'm like, that's fine too. And a lot of people were upset or concerned for me. Let's put it that way, not upset, but concerned that I was upset that Courtney was obviously not in her 30s at the time, and she's a blonde. And I'm like, that didn't matter to me. What mattered to me was that Emma was strong, that she was dedicated to her friends and to science, and that she was learning about being emotionally brave and physically brave at the same time. So they kept, the stories changed quite a bit, but they kept those core elements, which were so important to me.
Mhm.
Part of the reason I wrote the books the way I did was because I'd run into so many tropes in popular culture about archaeologists being obsessive or unleashing demons that were better left undisturbed, or all these things. And I'm like, I want to put the real archaeology in there because it's what I loved. And I thought people would like to see that too. And they did a good job of trying to convey some of that without making it into a documentary. Because I know that's,
No.
that's not going to be any fun at all. Except for me. I like watching people look at dirt. Not everyone does.
Yeah, I'm watching them get muddy when you're safe and dry.
Mm-hmm.
No bugs, no bugs. I'm here. I'm on the couch with the popcorn. You're taking
Yep.
care
Easier on the knees and the back. I'm not hauling the buckets of dirt. It's pretty sweet.
Yeah, or trying to sift said buckets of dirt, especially when it gets wet.
Oh yeah. Yes, yes. You've been reading closely, or you've had some experience yourself. You get some great upper body muscles, that's for sure.
Oh yeah, yeah, I know. Well, I've been a fan of archaeology as an armchair archaeologist
Hmm.
for most of my life. So yes, this was definitely right up my alley. But the this is all, stuff with Emma Fielding. The For the first five books, she gets down and dirty.
Mm.
She's right there, even if she's as in the More Bitter Than Death, she's off in a isolated, your sort of locked hotel mystery,
Yeah.
um, or which where a conference is taking place. She still gets down and dirty in that one, even though she's supposed to be dressed up. But the last book in the series, number six, is a bit of an outlier. Ashes and Bones focuses on less on the physical archaeology and more on the academia, which is generally more dangerous, and the pervasive harassment and gaslighting of women, not just in archaeology or academia, but across the board.
Mm.
That this is something, and the issue of that also relates to the lies at the heart of the Kindly Sea, your short story in Give the Devil His Due, which was a charity anthology for something called the Pixel Project. Could you talk about the Pixel Project and how these things intersect, um, for our viewers? Because I don't think they're aware of it. I wasn't
Mm.
until I read about the Kindly Sea.
Yeah, the Pixel Project is a wonderful organization. They work to fight violence against women all around the world. And they have numbers on social media where women who are in abusive situations can find help or find some way to get out of those abusive situations. It's spearheaded by this amazing young woman named Regina Yao, and she has organized some mystery writers, urban fantasy writers, science fiction writers to talk about these tropes in fiction, and we have conversations about our writing and how violence against women may figure into it, or how we change what happened to it, what happens in that narrative. And one of the things that she did, and Regina and the Pixel Project did, was to come up with the idea for a charity anthology called Giving the Devil His Due. And the idea was it was meant to be a cross between a Promising Young Woman and The Twilight Zone. So they were all stories in which an abuser or abusers were going to get their comeuppance, and there might be, did that really happen? Was it mystical, or was it just, did we see something wrong the wrong way? And so for me, The Kindly Sea was a way of talking about some of the gaslighting that goes on in academia with women, some of the assumptions that are made. I've had people say, well, no use investing too much in her education. This is at the graduate level. She got married. She's going to go back to New England and we'll never hear from her again. I've had people say that I was not the first person on the list to get funding because I was married. It's not that we were rolling in dough. It just meant that my husband had a job and I had a tiny teaching stipend. Um, and just, people looking behind me to see who the real archaeologist was. Sometimes they assume it was my husband. Sometimes they would just assume it was anyone else, and trying to establish one's bona fides and prove that, yeah, I'm the one who's going to be lifting the buckets of dirt. I'm going to be the one that's moving things out of the way. And most of the crews I've worked on with all women are just powerhouses. So I wanted to take some of that and some of the nasty attitudes I ran into academia and put that into the story, because not everything in the story was based on something that actually happened to me. But if I'd followed a certain path, or if certain other characters in my life had taken more advantage, it could have gone that way easily. And so I was able to draw from a lot of feelings, and that is what really fueled the story. I spend most of my stories are about women finding power, something really important to me and something I champion either through Sisters in Crime, for example, which is a great organization that helps especially women writers get more notice, and through networking and such. And anytime I can do something to help raise money for a cause to help women or education, that's where some of my weaving and spinning comes into play, or sign a book. But I mean, I'm almost always there to help support other women when I can. Great thing about that collection was that it was shortlisted for the Shirley Jackson Award for Best
Ooh,
Collection.
cool.
Yeah, and I was just thrilled to death to be a part of that. So it was a very positive experience all around, despite the fact that a lot of the stories were very hard to take, but they always ended on the right side of things, so that made it a little bit easier.
Justice was served.
Yes.
Yeah. And before we started the interview, I didn't do anything on the page about your weaving. I've seen it on various social media sites. And can I ask, how did that all happen? And, was it part of studying the colonial period and wanting to do some of the things that the people you were studying were doing to get a feel for them? Or was it just something you'd done from your childhood, like, some of us crochet?
Oh no, yeah, no. And that's the thing. I desperately wanted to learn how to knit, and I can't. I keep stabbing the yarn. I keep stabbing myself, and it always ends up in tears. And I was at a state fair. I think it was the Minnesota State Fair, or the Indianapolis State, or the Indiana State Fair. But I saw them weave. I'm like, oh wait, the yarn is all there and it has a nice structure. I can work with that. There will be far less stabbing involved. And so I got a little toy loom, I mean, a little tiny thing that kids would learn on, and I realized I was addicted. And so I have a couple of small looms, and from there I kind of got into spinning, and it's become very important to me in the past couple of years. And it does actually do a lot. Excuse me, it does a lot to inform me how women might have spent their day. If you walk around, you see the distaffs where they keep the fiber,
Yeah.
linen or wool, and so they can do this. They can spin with a drop spindle while they're walking, because you don't have time to not be doing something.
Mm-hmm.
And if you're trying to spin and the lights, I have a lot of lighting and very, I can position it and I can see the work really carefully. But if you only have daylight and candlelight and firelight to work by, it's a whole different critter. So it really does inform a lot of the way I think about the past, especially when I'm writing it.
Mm-hmm.
But it's become an addiction too. I have a wool stash now, and it's getting out of hand.
Yeah,
No,
they
it's
do.
entirely, yeah. It's I have not reached yet was the sable level, which is stash above the level of existence or something like that. You know, unlikely to be used before I die. But I'm trying to keep up with it, and I try not to buy any fiber unless I have a plan for it. Doesn't always happen that way.
Yeah, and oh, storage is a problem. I had some lovely wool that it took me
Mhm.
years to get back to, and by the time I got back to it, it was literally falling apart, either
Oh,
from moths or mice damage. I didn't even know we had mice.
oh
So
no.
I feel the whole sable level.
Yeah, yeah.
And
Uh,
somebody gave me a T-shirt that said knitting because murder is wrong, and it shows a black cat with the knitting needles.
yep. It's like I stabbed this thing 3,000 times. I was so angry, it's like needlework or something like that. Yeah, I've done a little bit of needlework too, just to again get the idea of what goes into a workaday garment, a coarse garment versus what goes into a fine garment. So you see the
Oh
difference
gosh.
between a plain wool tunic or shift or something like that, versus something you see, it's silk and embroidery and satin, and everyone's wearing high heel shoes and they're, silver jewelry
and
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 gold.
and they talk about men's armor weighed 50 pounds, and you look at those women's dresses from the Renaissance to the early 20th century, and they all weigh 40 pounds, and they're all flammable.
Yep, yep. And I one of my favorite things is to look at a photograph of a Victorian sitting room, and then think about the size of the hoops at different, from the mid part of the century later, and like, how do you navigate that? How do you move so you don't clear off a whole table full of porcelain shepherdesses or something like that?
Yeah,
And you don't. You
and one of
don't.
the most interesting bits visually for me watching To Catch a Thief,
Hmm.
the Cary Grant movie, was when Grace Kelly and her cinema mom are in that 18th century Marie Antoinette period gowns, and they have to sidle through doorways, which was actually so accurate to the time, and it puts the way furniture is arranged in a room
Hmm.
and all of these things into such perspective to understand the clothing and its manufacture to do that. And you've done a number of, getting back to short stories, your short stories have led you in some rather interesting directions. There's a couple of medieval short stories associated with your Fangborn series,
Hmm.
and then the short stories related to Anna Hoyt, we'll get to. But let's go back to the short stories and where they take you.
Mm.
Um, One, we've talked about The Kindly Sea, but that wasn't really your first foray into fantasy. Short stories took you into a world of vampires and werewolves and oracles, which became the Fangborn urban fantasy series. How did you get started writing those short stories and that series as a whole?
That was by having great friends, really. Um, Charlene Harris and Tony L.P. Kellner, sometimes known as Lee Perry. I think they've also been part of the ConTinual community at one point, are my good friends. And at one point, they were working on a series of anthologies featuring supernatural creatures and holidays.
Hmm?
And they asked me if I'd like to write a story about a werewolf at the holidays in winter. And I was like, oh, my gosh, yes, please. I mean, I was so proud and everything. And then I finished up, the conversation we were having, and I run back to my office here, my library, and I'm looking, academic that I am, looking for my reference work on werewolves. And I didn't have any. And I'm like, now wait a minute. What am I going to do? I mean, what's the canon? And so is it Anne Rice? Is it Charlene? Is it Bram Stoker? But those are mostly werewolves. And where do we get? I mean, is it just movies? And what do I know about werewolves? And it took me a good solid sweaty 15 minutes. I mean, cold running sweat of thinking, what am I going to do? I can't let these folks down. They've been so gracious, and um, I don't want to fall on my face. And then, having written 6 novels and a couple of short stories, it finally came to me that I can make this up. It's fiction. And it was just this thing. It's like, oh, of course, no problem. And oh, you idiot at the same time. Um, and after that, I'm like, okay, so I don't need to follow anyone's trope. I can make up my own idea of how these creatures work. And so I sort of took a lot of tropes from werewolf and vampire stories and flipped them on their head. So the enmity between werewolves and vampires, it's not because they automatically hate each other, it's because they're all family and they're trying to work out through a lot of politics, and do they reveal themselves to humanity as large. My vampires get charged up by sunlight, so if they spend too much time in the dark, they become weaker. And I decided that if I was gonna just flip everything around, why not have them be the secret superheroes, dedicated to for protecting humanity from evil. And I really like that because it gave me sort of like X-Men working in secret to help humanity, and so with a big dash of Buffy the Vampire Slayer, with a little bit of Raiders of the Lost Ark mixed up in there. And all of a sudden, I'm like, okay, I want this to be set near where I was living at the time, Salem, Massachusetts, and I want the werewolves to
Oh.
sound like me. I was like, okay, so we have some working class werewolves with with the North Shore accent and everything. And it just, Jerry came very easily to me after that, because like he said, he said one thing in my head, and I'm like, I like being a werewolf for the same reason I like being a cop, or I like being a cop for the same reason I like being a werewolf. And later on, he of course becomes disenchanted with the police, but it's the idea that he's helping people, and he's very naive and has this noble idea. And I really loved his dedication to that idea, to that purpose, that belief in himself. And that was
And
a lot of fun.
how
Sorry.
did you transition from a male werewolf to a woman who is an archaeologist and trying not to be other, as it were?
Yep. That's a really good question. That was something that gave me trouble for a long time. And there were two different things that happened there. One was Tony and Charlene both recommended, it's like, hey, try to write a novel, because we haven't seen anything like this before. You've been doing all these short stories. You have the world. Just go for it. And I was working on something, and it wasn't working. It wasn't doing well. And the other hand, I was on vacation with Tess Gerritsen, the amazing crime writer behind Rosolian Isles, the Rosolian Isles series, and she's a really good friend, and she's into archaeology too. And she says, okay, you need to write a story and set it in Turkey, and it has to be set around, in the Roman era, this, that, and the other thing. I'm like, okay, so I started working on that, make it an archaeological thriller. And it wasn't working. It was really boring. And I'm like, okay, if I'm bored, no one else. And the Fangborn thing wasn't working. It was a lot of driving back and forth and thinking, which does not make for a great action scene. And then I was on my way from the Mystery Writers of America Edgar Awards and going to Malice Domestic. Tony and I were on the train, and I suddenly realized that I had two halves of the same book. They weren't two separate books. And so all of a sudden, if I made my archaeologist a werewolf, and she was trying desperately not to be, as you said, other, and she is broke and this, that, and the other thing, and all of a sudden you could have those archaeological adventures, but also have the werewolf adventures. And that's how I eventually came up with Zoe Miller. And it kept me going through 3 novels and another flock of short stories. So I was really grateful for that moment.
Yeah, no, that worked fine. It just all worked out great. But you haven't totally abandoned straight mystery, or and you have a historical mystery series about an colonial era, right up your alley, a colonial era barkeep named of Anna Hoyt. And I understand from the web that she's going to get a novel, but the thing I don't understand, colonial era, this is your bailiwick. I mean, you even lived in Salem, Massachusetts, for crying out loud. Um, you've said online that she is incredibly hard to write. Why is this?
It's not that she's hard to write or the setting is hard to write. I mean, the reason I started writing her about Anna was that I was asked if I had someone had dropped out of the Boston Noir collection, one of the Akashic City Noir series,
Yes.
and they needed someone in a hurry. And a friend of mine asked me and said, "Hey, do you write short stories?" And at that point, I'd written like 2. I said, "Yeah, of course I do," because that's what you do when you're a writer. You say, "Yes, of course." And it was everyone. I don't know if you know about the series, but all the writers take a different section of a city and write a story, usually crime, noir, stuff there. And this was being edited by Dennis Lehane.
Whoa.
And it was another moment like, oh, wow, cool. I have a chance. And I only had about a week or 2 weeks. I think it was 2 weeks to get it in because someone had dropped out. They needed to make sure it was going to work. And I was sweating a lot. I was like, I don't know what to do. Am I going to make it academic noir? No, that's too close to my life. I didn't want to spend any more time there. I'm like, oh, I could set it in the north end of Boston, where all the, a lot of the trading was going on, a lot of taverns. If I set it in the 18th century, I don't think well as a 20th or 21st century criminal, but as an 18th century criminal, I can do all sorts of shenanigans. And I'm like, oh, so what if I make it like one of those golden era noir movies of the 40s where you have an embattled blonde and everyone's out for something. And once I realized, oh, I was putting my desperation of trying to come up with this story into Anna, and the fact that she owns a tavern, which was very unusual. She owns it outright
Yes.
at the time. And the fact that different criminals wanted to buy it from her because it was in a prime place on the waterfront. Her husband was going to sell her out, and she was having a bad time. And I realized, what will she do to survive? She has this one thing that is working for her, but what will she do to survive? And it turns out she'll do quite a lot. And it's not that writing the era is difficult. What was difficult was realizing after the first storm, like, oh, she really is a sociopath. I hadn't realized at first. I just felt that desperation. And then I realized how many bodies were racked up by the end of the story. Like, okay, she's probably not as noble a creature as I would hope. Or most of my characters tend to be on that heroic side, and she's definitely not. But I loved finding situations as she kept surviving, getting a little bit more power, there would be more and different attacks. And so I wrote a handful of short stories for her, and I'm thinking that the novel will be out either this year or next year. But she going into that mindset, I can get there, but then coming out and realizing, okay, I'm not in this kind of physical danger. My livelihood is not being threatened. I'm fine. It takes me a minute to walk it off. And that's what I mean when I say it's difficult to write her, because she looks at everyone like, how can I make you work for me? Are you a mark? Are you a predator? And being in that mindset, and then having, perfectly good husband and friends and family and cats out the outside. Hi, how are you doing? And I'm like, I need to be away for a bit, and then sort of give myself a chance to come out of her mind and back into my real life, my reality. So yeah, she's a character, all right. I was surprised by her.
Yeah, that is really out in left field in some ways, even more than werewolves and vampires, because
Mhm.
as you say, the goal of Jerry is to help people. The goal of Zoe is to survive, but still has a respect and a mission
Mhm.
as an archaeologist, because you're basically preserving knowledge for humanity as a whole. So
Mhm.
it's a humanitarian act, even as history is. Whereas with Anna, it sounds like, as you were talking, it reminded me of that chapter in Red Harvest.
Mm.
Also, which of course is the basis for Yojimbo,
Yep.
and a number of other things. The chapter heading that read "The 17th Murder."
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, hearing Anna's backstory, though, makes AKA Jayne a lot more understandable. She's your current, your hero of the moment. Could you tell folks a little bit about the character, where
Mhm.
she came from, and then let's talk about the new novel, Exit Interview. So
Yay.
let's
We
get
love
us,
that.
yeah.
Thanks. Let's see. I wrote I've always loved thrillers. I like thrillers because I like the pace. I like that hero who most often is someone who is supremely confident and competent. Um, and for me, thrillers with that kind of action is as much a fantasy as werewolves and vampires, as far as I'm concerned. You're dealing with superheroic characters, superpowers, whether they are supernatural or not, in my opinion, looking at them as a writer and a reader. And every once in a while, I really like to go in one of the stories and hang out with Jack Reacher or Jason Bourne. And it always by me, I was like, I keep looking for the franchises with the women in this role. And there are some writers who have long running series with them, but nothing that gets quite the same thing. And there might be women in some of the newer Bond movies and such, or in the Jason Bourne series, but they always tend to be behind a desk, behind a computer. They never seem to be quite as capable. And when I was writing the Emma Fielding books, one of the questions that comes up in cozies is, how is your protagonist going to protect herself? Generally not guns sometimes. And I realized, oh, well, Emma's not the kind to want a gun. So I'd heard about Krav Maga, mixed martial arts, and
Right.
so I started studying that because a local place just opened. And I'm
Mhm.
like, okay, well, let's check that out. And I enjoyed it. I was bad at it. I was very bad at it. I spent a lot of time in physical therapy, but I love the idea of figuring out how to overcome someone or get out of a scrap that you were in or scrape that you were in. And so I began writing more action scenes with Emma. And then it was a natural thing when I'm writing the Fangborn because, you have the animal physicality when they change and you have them souped up a speed and strength when they're in their half changed forms. And that was just more and more fun. And then I really just wanted to write a thriller with a woman who was not counting all the beats you often see in movies. If you say, like the movie Salt with Angelina Jolie, for example, I could tell you one, two, three, okay, she's going to be nice to a kid. Three, four, five, she's going to pat a dog. And she's always, the character is inevitably looking to avenge her dead husband or find her lost father. And that's all it strips. And I wanted Jayne to have none of that. I want her to go in and say, look, these guys are wrong. They're the bad guys. They need to get sorted. I'm going to take care of it. And just use all the stuff I learned about hand-to-hand combat and shooting and, all the stuff that you want to see in a fun action movie. Because it's fun to take that break for 90 minutes or 300 pages and just like, yeah, we're going to go beat up bad guys. It's awesome. And so I really wanted Jayne to be that character. And so I wrote a couple of short stories for Ellery Queen. And we didn't have her name at that point. She was just whoever she needed to be in the moment. So I referred to her as A.K.A. Jayne. And then when I started writing what would eventually become Exit Interview, I started learning more about her. And that was interesting too. So writing that novel for me I had a couple of goals. I wanted to have most of the characters who are usually represented by male characters in most of the tropes. I wanted them all to be women. I wanted Jayne to be, have like, yeah, I punched him in the face and then I used my knife on him. That's what you do. And other people going, oh, that's not really very nice. Says, well, it's not very nice, is it? And you're not dead and I'm not dead, so it's all good. I wanted my reporter character to be the one who's sort of more like me and saying like, what do you do when you have something that is too big for the government to deal with, or the government doesn't know what's happening? What do you do? What's the right way to be a good citizen? And how do you do that? And so, of course, they're going to have quite opposing views on this. And the third character is the one who, because these days you don't have a thriller without technology, was someone who was going to have that brain and have that instinct for finding people to finding ways to get through people through the internet, through their devices, through their car alarms, anything like that. But I also want to point out that, if there was a character like this who was in the same service as Jayne, she'd also have physical skills. Maybe not as honed, but she has the idea of like, well, if I can do this and it's bloodless, why wouldn't we do that? And Jayne says, no, 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 no. If you kill someone who needs it, they're dead. We don't have to worry about them anymore. So I liked those tensions. It was kind of a way for me to think about philosophy, but have a really good time writing an action story at the same time.
Mhm. No, that's great. That's
Yeah.
great. What is could you tell us, a little bit about the setup of Exit Interview? And I believe it came from something you overheard with your husband that he was going through an exit interview.
Yeah, it was
And, tell us a little bit about that setup and, what readers can expect when they go into this specific novel.
Yeah, it was funny. It's one of those weird things that I think happens to writers who are used to hearing things a little differently or looking at the world a little differently. Or maybe it's just me. That's possible too. But he had just finished up working at a big tech company, and I said, "Well, you've been wrapping up everything. When do you get? Are you home now?" And he goes, "No, no, I have to go in tomorrow for the exit interview." I'm like, "What's that?" And he says, "Well, it's when you go and you talk with your boss and some of your peers about what was good and what was working and what wasn't." I said, "Well, it doesn't sound very nice." And he goes, "No, so sometimes it isn't." Um, I said, well, I bet it's even worse if you're a covert operative. And all of a sudden it's like, oh, that's a story. I mean, and so the idea of Exit Interview fed me the idea that there would be a reporter attempting to do an interview about this whole thing. She was caught up in the investigation of an arms merchant,
Mhm.
an arms dealer with an unholy number of weapons at his disposal, and investigating him when he dies suddenly and suspiciously in front of her. And that's what brings the reporter and the covert operatives together, because Jayne is being framed for the job.
Mhm.
And that was it was something that was really an eye opener for me, because when I started looking into arms dealing, I had no idea of how much of it is legal, how much of it is illegal, but easily
Mhm.
easily traded under the noses of the authorities. I mean, if you say it's a crate full of 100 rifles and you say that it's agricultural supplies, you can, as long as your paperwork looks to be in order, you can get away with an awful lot. I found that terrifying. Um, so I really liked the idea that there was something that big at stake and something real world at stake. Um, so that was it. It gave me an opportunity to uh, read all sorts of amazing books about folks who were in uh, covert ops or who were working in the intelligence community, which is fascinating. Every time I'd go to Malice Domestic, I'd run to the International Spy Museum and loot the bookstore for exciting books on things like biological warfare and chemical warfare. And at one point, one of the cashiers looked and said, "Where did you get this book?" I'm like, "Oh God," and I'm like, "It was right over there." And he goes, "Oh yeah, because it looks good. I got to get one too." I'm like, "Okay," so I'm not in trouble. But it was like, it was an amazing experience, and it was very different from me being in my academic brain, my academic life, and learning about the joys of fighting.
Mhm.
I learned how to shoot. I'm not very good at it. I don't like guns. Guns terrify me, um, because they are so attractive and such an elegant machine and capable of such terrible things. But shooting them is a lot of fun. Shooting targets is a blast. And I'm like, oh, I can. And so Jayne started coming to me in those moments where I'm like, this is not something I really want to like. And yet it was.
Mhm.
Um, and yeah, so it was a lot of fun. It was such a different thing. And it was so much fun to just be with Jayne and like have her like, nope, nope, this person had it coming. Nope, and I'm gonna go after this guy too, and then we'll sort other things out.
You don't normally base your characters on real life individuals, but if it were me, the temptation of throwing some real life villains under the bus just when Jane's driving it would be overwhelming.
It's that I will say that that kind of motivation helps sometimes. I was working on another story for another charity fundraiser for it's called Killing Malman, and it was a charity collection of mystery and crime writers writing to help raise money to fight MS. And the joke was is that Dan Malman and his wife Kate Malman they're the ones behind the fundraiser, and people write a story about killing Dan Malman, and he's the sweetest, nicest guy imaginable, super smart, really, very gentle person. And so the idea of him getting killed off repeatedly in all these stories has became a thing. And so they bundled up a bunch into this collection. And I'm like, how am I going to kill Dan? We love Dan. We love Kate. And I made him. I changed the physicality into a public figure who I will not name, who was on my naughty list, and it became much easier at that point. The violence came, it flowed. So so if I don't base it on people, I might take some attributes, but I will take my own responses to them
Yes,
and
yes.
use that. And that's really more. It's really efficient for me.
Yeah. Is it hard to switch between the more cerebral mysteries with less action, like Emma, to something as action driven as The Fangborn and Jayne? Or is it just like taking a sherbet between courses of a heavy meal? Is it fun to go back and forth and sort of like a vacation from, oh, I was doing all this archaeological or this historical work. Ooh, let me just blow things up. Oh, I've blown too much up. Oh, I can practically smell the cordite. I need to go back.
It's like when watching Mythbusters and their 10 best explosions comes on. It's like, oh yeah, I need to use some of that in there. It's like, where can I blow up a cement mixer? That was one of my favorites. But yeah, it is a bit of a palate cleanser, as you said. It's kind of that sherbet. but also even as I was working on the Emma books, I got to enjoy the action scenes more and more. But flipping back and forth between these things, if they're different, it can really be a lifesaver in terms of being a working writer, because if you're stuck on one project, you go and noodle around on the other one, and because your brain is not so focused on that one problem, it probably comes up as you're working on the other thing. So I like to have one or two projects, you know, plan A, plan B, so I can keep that energy going. And if one's not working, at least I'm making progress on something else. And by shifting my attention like that, it does help solve some of the problems. And if all else fails, I put, you know, asterisk, 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 ask readers, beta readers to help me figure this out, like, or make this better. But, you know, but it is nice to be able to flip back and forth, because what I hope to do with some of the Emma books is realize that some of these adventures that are so cerebral, like opening the diary of someone who's been dead for 300 years for the first time and wondering what you can see, is every bit as thrilling for me as finding a really, really cool artifact.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's nice to be able to share those moments that are quieter, but no less have no less impact on you, or on me, I should say. I hope on readers too.
No, I understand totally, totally. You've mentioned that your writing style is more on the order of, I'm writing a scene, I've got this picture, I've got this thing, and I'll write it down, and then I'll go to the next one I've got, and then I'll figure out how it all fits together, more of a discovery process.
Yeah.
Do you find that this is good for something like a thriller, where you have so many moments of discrete action, or is it intensely nerve-wracking?
I find this is the way I write. It's my normal mindset. I'm seeing it as if I'm watching a movie. I'm like, oh, that's really cool. Or, oh, look at the way those two characters are interacting. Write that down. Oh, this would be really neat if this thing blowed up right here. Or like, oh, but why is so and so behaving so shifty? And getting all those things, I just find the things that are most interesting to me, write them down, and then, as you say, rearrange them. An analogy I've used is like I'm collecting beads of different shapes and sizes, and then figuring out how to put them together to make a necklace that has, you know, balance and is pleasing aesthetically and that sort of thing. I am an organic writer. I'm a chaotic pantser, some would say. I once managed to terrify Terry Brooks of, you know, sort of Shannara fame. We were sitting together at a convention, and we were talking about, like, he starts at the beginning, goes straight through, and does an outline and all that good stuff. And I explained my process, and he turned around and looked at me and says, "You terrify me. You're the kind of writer who terrifies me." I'm like, "Look, I'm just doing my thing." It's like, you know, some people write longhand, some people want to sit at their keyboard, some people are lefties and righties. So, you know, you just do what gets the pages going. You do what get the words out there. And what I like to think is that if I come up with enough cool scenes, I will minimize the amount of of boring bits, so I don't have to cut them out later. Or if I find just the barest amount of connective tissue, then I'm not gonna have a big. It gives me a reason to really work on having a big glut of exposition or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
So I just, that's what I do. I have, you know, I do have notebooks, but I also have little scraps of paper, receipts, napkins, envelopes with all sorts of notes, and it accumulates into a pile. And then I'm like, oh yeah, that was really cool. That's how those two things connect up.
Mm-hmm.
And so it is a process of discovery. It's a process of association. And sometimes it's just seeing two people on the street and thinking, okay, there's some kind of crazy energy there. I want to use that in a scene somehow, because it seems like something is going to happen. You know, it needn't be explosive or violent. It could just be very intense. And just,
Or it
like,
could be a barista explaining chemistry.
yeah, it could be something like that. And boom, you know that it fits in there somewhere.
What are you
Yeah.
working on now?
Oh gosh, I have two projects I'm working on. One is I am working on a Sherlockian pastiche.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I've written a couple of pastiches, you know, based on Arthur Conan Doyle's Sherlock Holmes. One was with Fangborn story, which I thought was a good way of explaining all of Dr. Watson's forgetfulness about where he was wounded in Afghanistan. And how many wives did he have, and what were their names? And I came up with a fun solution for that. But then I also wrote another short story called Where There's Honey. That was for Laurie King and Les Klinger. And one of the things about Sherlock Holmes that really fascinates me is that you have two gentlemen who, if they're not rich, they're certainly middle class, they're well educated, they have access, they have privilege. Why do they spend all their time with the worst people in London, either from the sewer to palaces? Why are they so immersed in that world when they could be doing anything else? And it occurred to me that this is actually very noir. I mean, these two people have been through trauma in one way or another and are either working it out or atoning for their sins or whatever by doing what they're doing. And I like that kind of a character study. So I wrote that story a while back, and I am working on another short story with that same sort of noir take on Holmes and Watson. And with any luck, I'll finish it next week because I need to get work on Anna Hoyt, the novel. Because despite what I've said about her being difficult to live with, I know a lot of readers are very invested in her, and they're like, yeah, I need her in my world. I need to know, I need to think about her and think, okay, what would Anna do? And maybe I could do that without being quite so bloody about it. And it's that kind of revenge thing, I think, that a lot of people find satisfying. It's like, yeah, she survived in spite of everything else.
Mhm.
So I have a bit of noir writing to do in the future, and then I'll figure out what's next.
You've been involved in the various Sherlock organizations, I believe. You're involved in two of the major ones, and were in Britain for a dinner recently.
No, not in Britain, in New York. But
Okay.
folks from the New York dinner did go to the London dinner. Yeah,
Okay. Okay.
yeah. I am a member of the Baker Street Irregulars, which is
Yeah.
the oldest literary society devoted to Sherlock Holmes in the world. I received the investiture of the Giant Rat of Sumatra, which comes from the Sussex vampire. And I love the line after when someone refers to the Giant Rat of Sumatra, and it's like a tale for which the world is not yet ready. Um, and I'm also a member of ASH, the Adventuresses of Sherlock Holmes.
Mhm.
Women were not allowed to be full participating members of the Baker Street Irregulars until 1991. And I think that's right. And that's kind of
100 years after the first appearance.
it. Yeah. And so this amazing group of women would protest every January out in the snow, and eventually were instrumental in getting women to be full members. And I'm very proud to be part of that organization because they are truly badass. They are wonderful and smart, savvy folks. And the birthday dinner, most people agree that Sherlock Holmes's birthday was on January 6th, and so the Baker Street Regulars meet and have their annual birthday weekend, and then either a week later or a week before, I forget how it works. The Sherlock Holmes Society meets, and many of the folks go either there or come to the New York dinner.
Right. Right.
So there's been a lot of that recently. So yeah, it was a busy weekend.
Cool.
A lot
Cool.
of fun. Always a lot of fun.
And somehow it's entirely appropriate that Sherlock Holmes is a Capricorn. It just works.
I had never thought of that. I will have to look into that because that was something that probably would have been popular in the Victorian era
Well,
to look at things like that.
theoretically, Capricorns are all about Capricorns, every in our astrology, as any form of mystical thought,
Mhm.
there's a good side and a bad side to
Sure.
everything. And assuming that Sherlock Holmes, for whatever reason, is on the side of the angels, he typifies the tidy mind and orderliness of the Capricorn in upholding what is right and proper of the existing order.
Oh, cool.
And so, yeah, it works out it works out very well. Um, Capricorns are not necessarily the brightest signs, but the brightest signs are not necessarily the most, shall we say, noble.
Nice. Oh, I like it. It's better and
So,
better.
but it works out really, really well. Unfortunately, this hour's gone by so fast. So, but we do have one question that we always ask,
Mhm.
and it's the freebie. You've got the floor, you've got the soapbox. Is there anything you'd like to add?
I don't, if people are reading and enjoying Exit Interview, I hope you'll leave reviews someplace. It's always helpful to any author if you leave reviews because it helps with the algorithms and such. Uh, Keep your eyes open for Anna Hoyt and support your local independent bookseller whenever possible.
I agree with all of that. So thank you, Dana, and thank you from ConTinual.